time back today. A special thank you to my panel members and of course my supervisors for all their time and contributions over the last 3.5 years now. Today I'm going to be presenting my final year review, which is titled Aggression and Mental Ill Health in Adolescents as Friendship Groups, a 4-year longitudinal study. Before I get into the talk, I just want to provide a quick overview of what I'm going to be chatting about for the next 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to start by introducing some of the background literature and discuss how my research fits into it. I'll then quickly run through the main hypotheses of my research before going into the first main component of my analysis, which is conceptualising friendship groups. After that, I'm going to present some results from some multi-level models, after which I'll quickly summarise everything before briefly running you through the candidature timeline, after which there'll be a bit of time for discussion and questions as well. So starting first with the background literature. One of the most robust findings in the developmental literature is the powerful influence that friends have on the behaviours and beliefs of young people. The research has tended to focus on externalising behaviours, so for example aggression, and a number of longitudinal studies have found that it's the friends' levels of aggressive behaviour that subsequently influence the aggression of the individual. More recently, this research has moved towards looking at internalising behaviours as well, so mental ill health, for example. And as with aggression, the longitudinal studies are reporting similar patterns and associations, whereby if an individual is a member of a friendship group that suffers from high levels of mental ill health, then they're likely to suffer from worse mental ill health subsequently. To date, these two lines of research, so the focus on externalising and the focus on internalising, has remained quite separate. So we don't know anything about, for example, how friendship group aggression might impact friendship group mental ill health. And this is quite surprising given that there's a very well-established link between individual aggression and individual mental ill health. Again, with the longitudinal empirical studies suggesting that mental ill health is in fact a consequence of engaging in aggressive behaviours. So this brings us to the first main aim of my research, which is to examine the longitudinal associations between both aggression and mental ill health in the context of friendship groups. But in order to do that, I first need to get my friendship groups. And while there is a lot of agreement in the literature as to the importance of friends, there's no agreed upon definition and there's no agreed upon way in which to conceptualize a friendship group. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to review 3 different ways that I'll be looking at for my thesis. The first of these are reciprocal friendships. So this is where the friendship is acknowledged by both parties in the friendship. So for example, Monica nominates Phoebe as a friend, and Phoebe also nominates Monica as a friend. This is one of the most widely used conceptualizations of friendship because there's evidence as well to suggest that reciprocated friendships are of higher quality and they have a greater buffering effect against some of the negative stressors that are involved with being an adolescent. However, there are potentially some limitations. It might be quite a restrictive view actually to examine friendship groups through. The first reason for this is that only about 40% of friendship nominations that are made tend to be reciprocated. So straight away we're discounting about 60% of friendship data that we have available to us. Also there is evidence to suggest that non-reciprocated friendships are also a really important source of influence. So Faris and Ennett, for example, investigated in adolescents reciprocated and non-reciprocated friendships, and they did find that non-reciprocated friendships exerted a significant influence on the behaviours of the individual independent of the influence exerted from reciprocal friendships. The second potential kind of limitation of reciprocal friendships is that they're quite rare actually in the context of adolescence. So it's quite uncommon for 2 people, even best friends, to be interacting in isolation of a broader friendship group. And this broader friendship group is going to have specific norms, it's going to have specific socially acceptable behaviours and things, all of which will exert an influence independent and in addition to a series of independent reciprocal relationships as well. So for those reasons, the literature has begun to look at non-overlapping friendship groups, or friendship groups more broadly. And the definition of a friendship group is still quite it's quite broad. So it's just that a group has more internal connections than it does external. And what this means is that the people within the group are identifying more people in the group as friends than they are identifying people outside of the group as friends. A number of different algorithms have been developed that are able to detect these groups within a broader social network, and the most accurate one at the minute is InfoMap. But there is a potential limitation with this again. In human social networks, overlap is extremely prevalent. So if you think of your own social networks and your own social groups, I can't imagine you're thinking of just one particular group that you're socializing in. So more recently, a different algorithm has been developed called the Lincoln algorithm, which is able to detect overlapping friendship groups within a social structure. So an individual can be a member of multiple different groups. And this is thought to potentially be a more ecologically valid way of conceptualizing groups, as it represents a more truer structure of the network that we're looking at. So this brings me to the second main aim of my research, which is to compare the consequences of using different friendship conceptualizations when looking at the associations between aggression and mental ill health. So what I'll do now is I'm going to run through the hypotheses of my research. So the first hypothesis is that a friendship group aggression will positively predict subsequent individual aggression. So if an individual is a member of a friendship group that is very aggressive, they are likely to become more aggressive at a subsequent time. My second hypothesis is that group mental ill health will positively predict individual mental ill health over time. So this is the same idea, whereby if an individual is a member of a group who's suffering from high levels of mental ill health, then they over time will start to suffer from worse mental ill health themselves as well. My third hypothesis is that individual aggression will predict individual mental ill health. So this is that there's a cost to engaging in aggressive behaviours at the individual level, where it negatively impacts an individual's mental ill health. The fourth hypothesis then involves group aggression and group mental ill health. And to date, no research has examined both group aggression and group mental ill health in the same study. But I think it's reasonable to hypothesize that a similar process might be happening at the group level as is at the individual level. So I'm hypothesizing that group aggression will positively predict group mental ill health over time as well. My fifth hypothesis then concerns the different friendship group conceptualizations. So I'm hypothesizing that the results will differ depending on how the groups are conceptualized. To date, reciprocal, non-overlapping and overlapping friendship groups have not been compared in a single study yet. So I don't have an a priori hypothesis about what exactly these differences will look like, but I do expect there to be some differences. So the data from the study came from the Australian Character Study, ACS, for which ethics approval and informed written consent was obtained prior to any data collection. Pen and paper questionnaires were administered to all participants in the 17 Catholic schools in the study. The schools came from New South Wales and Queensland. And the questionnaires were administered across 4 separate time points, so following the same participants from grade 8 through to grade 11. And in total, we had 2,865 participants taking part in this study. The participants completed the following measures. So to measure aggression, we used the Achenbach's aggression subscale from the Youth Self-Report Inventory, a sample item for which is I destroy things belonging to others. Mental ill health was measured using the 12-item general health questionnaire developed by Goldberg and Hilliard, a sample item for which is have you recently been feeling unhappy and depressed? And finally, friendship nominations were collected, and this involved asking participants to please nominate 5 of their closest male friends and 5 of their closest female friends. So this now brings us to the first main component of my analysis, which is conceptualizing the friendship groups and using the peer nomination data that was collected. So first is the reciprocal. So for each participant, I had a look at the nominations that they made, and I counted how many of the nominations they made were reciprocated. So how many times did they nominate someone and that person also nominated them back? From that data, I then calculated group aggression and group mental health scores as the average self-reported individual aggression scores of all their reciprocated friendships. For the non-overlapping friendship groups, I again took the peer nomination data and I converted it into an adjacency matrix, which then went into the InfoMap algorithm in R, and visually it produces groups that sort of look like this. And what I did then to calculate my group aggression and group mental ill health variables was to average the aggression and mental ill health scores of all the members of each group. finally, for the overlapping friendship groups, I again took the peer nomination data and this time ran it through the Lincoln algorithm in R, and it produces overlapping friendship groups. And we can just see any of the little dots with two different colours are a member of more than one group. So it's quite prevalent across the networks. An added issue when dealing with overlapping friendship groups and creating an aggregated group regression group mental health score is how we're going to weight the groups. For my thesis, I went through quite a number of different weighting procedures. In the interest of time, I'm going to just present the results from the last weighting procedure that I applied, which was where I selected an individual's, or I applied 100% of the weighting to an individual's biggest out-degree group. And let me explain that in a little bit more detail. So here we have participant A. So participant A is a member of two friendship groups, the purple group and the pink group. If we look first at the purple group, we can see that participant A has nominated 3 people as friends in their group. And this is evidenced from the arrows coming out of participant A. So the out degree for the purple group is 3. If we look at then the pink group, even though it's a bigger group, we can see that participant A has only nominated one other person within the group, as evidenced again from the arrow pointing out of the node. So the out degree score for the pink group is only 1. So for the weighting procedure that I applied in the results I'm about to present, I identified an individual's biggest out degree group, which is the purple group, and then calculated group regression and group mental health scores by averaging the individual regression and mental health scores of all of the members of that group. And the rationale for choosing out degree is that research has shown that youths are particularly influenced by those individuals who they nominate themselves as being friends. So by extension, we're putting a greater importance on the groups where individuals have identified as themselves as having friends within that group as well. So now we have our friendship, or our group regression and group mental health scores across our 3 friendship group conceptualizations, so reciprocal, non-overlapping, and overlapping. Now I was ready to do the multi-level model analyses on this data. So these are just all the models I ran. I will break this down. But just to say that I ran, for each of the different friendship conceptualizations, I ran 4 models. All the models had the same structure, so they were 2-level models with time estimated per student. All models included 4 predictive variables, which was lagged individual regression, lagged individual mental ill health, lagged group regression, and lagged group mental ill health. And then each model had a different outcome variable. So model 1, we were looking at predicting regression. Model 2, we were looking at predicting mental ill health, and so on. Model 3, group regression. I also controlled for school and gender in all of the models to account for any exogenous effects. So what I'm going to do now is run through those results in the context of my research hypotheses. So the first hypothesis was that group regression would positively predict individual regression over time. And I actually didn't find support for this hypothesis, as we can see here. So lagged group regression predicting individual regression. This means that an individual in a highly aggressive group was not impacted by the aggressive behaviours of their group. What was interesting though was I found the converse of this association, whereby individual aggression did predict future group aggression. So this is saying that if you have a very aggressive individual, over time their friends, their group are going to become more aggressive. And this was regardless of how the friendship groups were conceptualized as well. The second hypothesis of my research was that group mental health, ill health, would positively predict individual mental ill health over time. And again, I didn't actually find any support for this hypothesis. As we can see here, all of the estimates are very low in magnitude and all had a confidence interval that included 0. As with aggression, though, I did find the converse of this to be true, where individual mental health predicted group mental ill health over time. So a highly aggressive, or an individual suffering from high levels of mental ill health was likely to spread to their group at a subsequent time point, where their group would then suffer from worse mental ill health as well. So I just wanted to pause here for a moment before going through the rest of the hypotheses, because we've sort of already seen a trend in that the literature seems to say that group aggression predicts individual behaviours, but my research is showing that it's the individual that actually influences the group. This is quite a tricky thing to unpack. I don't have sort of a set answer, but what I did want to flag is that my models, there was 2 main differences between the models that I ran and the models that are being kind of run most frequently in the literature. The first is that a lot of the models that are investigating the impact of the group on an individual are not also looking at all the impact of the individual on the group. So, for example, group regression is only ever being included as a predictive variable and never as an outcome variable. So this is the first time that this has been done, and kind of calls into question some of that literature, given that its inclusion kind of seems to turn the results on its head a little bit. The other is that group regression and group mental ill health have also never been put into the same model together, and given that aggression and mental ill health seem to co-occur quite often, if you are aggressive, you tend to also suffer from worse mental ill health. It may be that including all of these variables in the same model might be conflicting some sort of unique variance, or just sort of having a little impact in that way, perhaps. But again, it's a trend I'm noticing. I'm not 100% sure what's going on here. My third hypothesis then was that individual aggression would positively predict individual mental ill health over time, and I did find support for this hypothesis. So regardless, obviously, of how you look at the friendship groups, mental ill health appears to be a consequence of aggression. My fourth hypothesis then was that group aggression, or a similar process would be happening at the group level. So group aggression would predict group mental ill health. So if a group was suffering or engaging in more aggression, they would suffer the cost of that as a group as well. And I found partial support for this hypothesis. So we can see here for the reciprocal friendship group conceptualization, I didn't find support. The confidence interval included 0. But for the non-overlapping and the overlapping, groups who engaged in higher levels of aggressive behaviour tended to suffer worse mental ill health at a later time point. So the same process at the individual level. But what was particularly interesting about the group level was that there appeared to be a sort of homeostatic process happening here, whereby group mental ill health also negatively predicted group aggression over time. So what this means is that a group who's engaging in high levels of aggressive behaviour tends to suffer worse mental ill health as a consequence of this. Once they're suffering from high levels of mental ill health, this tends to reduce their engagement in aggressive behaviours to a degree. So there is a sort of balancing effect or cancelling out effect that seems to be happening at the group level that's not seen at the individual level. My fifth hypothesis was that the results would differ depending on how the friendship groups were conceptualized, and I did find some evidence for this as well. So the non-overlapping friendship groups and the overlapping friendship groups seem to perform similarly. So the types of effects we were seeing, the types of associations between variables were similar, and also the magnitude of the effect sizes was also comparable. Reciprocal friendships, on the other hand, tended to not produce the same group level effects. So, for example, there was no evidence that individual aggression predicted group aggression in reciprocal friendships, and we also didn't see evidence for the homeostatic process in reciprocal friendships. So this does suggest that it matters how you conceptualize friendships. My thinking in the groups being different from the individual is that potentially there's some important factor of the context of the group, or the norms or the structures of the group that are somehow playing a role in the association between group aggression and group mental health. But it's important, knowing this, that researchers are cautious about generalizing findings that they get from any sort of research where they've conceptualized friendship groups, because it may not generalize if you look at the group in a different way, and things like that. So just being cautious and also making sure to use the friendship group conceptualization that's most appropriate to your research question. So just to quickly summarize what I've gone through, what I've done, I found that it was the individual aggression that predicted groups. So if you had an individual who engaged in high levels of aggression, their group was likely to do so too at a later time point. And the same for mental ill health. So individuals suffering from high levels of mental ill health was likely to influence their group's level of mental ill health. Mental ill health does appear to be a consequence of aggressive behaviour. And finally, at the group level, we see a really interesting homeostatic process happening, which is unique to the group level, whereby high levels of aggressive behaviour in the group result in worse mental ill health, which then seems to reduce their levels of aggression again as well. So just to quickly go through the candidature timeline, I've got about 6 months left. So I'll take a little time after this to incorporate any feedback that I get from the panel, and from the discussion, of course. There is just a little bit more tweaking with some models I want to finish up and write that up, and then I've got from December until the 6th of March to write my discussion, update my review, and wrap up before I submit. So thank you again everyone for being here and for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.